It's a matter of energy security. It's a matter of protecting consumers from rising energy prices in moments of crisis or turbulence in markets. So what seems like a huge expense right now is actually a really good investment for our energy system.
Welcome to the Warsaw Wire, the podcast about Poland's economy, business and energy transition. I'm Alicja Ptak, your host and Deputy Editor-in-Chief at Notes from Poland. 2026 is shaping up to be a pivotal year for Poland's energy transition. For the first time in its history, the country will begin producing electricity from offshore wind farms sometime this year. That may sound routine elsewhere in Europe, but in Poland it marks a major shift. The country still generates more than half of its electricity from coal, the highest share in the European Union. And for decades, its power system has been built around large coal-fired plants. Offshore wind represents not just a new technology, but also a new direction for the entire energy system, with the weight of electricity production moving from coal-heavy south to soon-to-be emission-low north. To understand what offshore wind means for Poland, how it compares to more established European markets, and what challenges still lie ahead, I am joined today by Marianna Sobkiewicz, a senior analyst at the Polish Economic Institute. Marianna recently authored a report on changing ownership models in offshore wind in Europe, with a particular focus on the Baltic Sea and Poland. She will help us place Poland's offshore ambitions in a wider European and regional context. Marianna, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, before we talk about offshore wind specifically, can you briefly explain to us where Poland is currently in its energy transition?
Poland's energy transition is definitely at a point where it's gaining momentum. I would say that this is a period where a lot of political advocacy work and regulatory work is materializing into many significant investments, and offshore wind is definitely one of them. As you have mentioned, Poland has long been reliant on coal for most of its energy. Only about 20 years ago, coal still constituted about 80% of the electricity generation, but now it has fallen to around 53%, which is it's still way too much. It's still not desirable, but it's definitely a substantial decrease. So even though Poland has long been a laggard in the energy transition, I would say this is changing.
And what is pushing Poland towards this change?
I would say that it all comes down to security, really. Energy security does not leave space for too much fossil fuel capacity in the system. What I mean by this is that the reliance of the European Union on the import of fossil fuels, which is necessary because we neither Poland nor any other countries in the EU are abundant in fossil fuels, so it is a must to import them. And this reliance creates a lot of insecurity. We have seen this time and time again, and most recently with the 2022 energy crisis. So the shift toward clean energy sources comes down to energy security, but also economic security, since fossil fuel prices are volatile. And then also, of course, social and environmental security. We have seen again and again in science, in research, that fossil fuels are detrimental to society and the environment. So it's in that sense, it's a no-brainer by now.
When we look at the data showing the growing share of renewables in Poland's energy system, I feel that we in Poland increased that share in the past 5 or so years very rapidly, but it slowed down last year. So I wonder what are the obstacles to this development of renewables in Poland, and maybe why it slowed down?
With renewables, it's not always a good idea to lump them all together. Renewables come in different shapes and forms and sizes. But of course, in Poland, the main renewables in the energy system are solar and onshore wind. With solar in particular, you've mentioned we've seen this huge increase of installations in the past decade, which was largely owing to the subsidy program offered by the government for micro installations for prosumers. So simply households could invest in solar energy at a discount, which led to the increase. However, the main obstacle here is the electricity grid. So we've come to a point where the electricity grid cannot really take many more of these sorts of installations. There's a long queue for permits. So I would say that's the main obstacle with solar. So now we actually see that most of the newly added solar capacity is larger installations. When it comes to onshore wind, social acceptance and political agreement is a huge issue. This has long halted the development of onshore wind in Poland. There's a lot of anti-wind activism, and it's powered by some political groups who oppose this type of energy. So we do see new capacity in onshore wind being added, but it's still much less than what it could be. That's the huge advantage in offshore wind, that it doesn't have the social acceptance issue.
Why is so? I mean, I assume it's because they are built far away from shore.
That's basically it. Actually, it's that simple. The fact that offshore wind installations are kilometers away from the coast means they don't disturb communities in any way. So they enjoy a high rate of social acceptance. They also don't disturb the marine environment. If everything is done correctly, and that's always ensured through sort of research in the area and permits, the impact on the environment around the wind farm is minimal. So there's really no sort of controversies around offshore wind.
Is the impact of the offshore wind also different on the power grid because of how centralized compared to the onshore wind it is?
There is a difference because firstly, offshore wind farms tend to be larger in capacity because you can simply put more wind turbines together to create a farm. If you do it offshore, whether of course if you want to develop an onshore wind farm, there's limited space simply. So it means that the farms are larger in capacity, and of course, as you said, more concentrated. So if you look at there's these diagrams online showing where the offshore wind farms in Poland along the Polish coastline will be located, you can actually see a lot of them are next to each other. So in that sense, you could say that it makes it easier to connect them to the grid, but that would be an overstatement because at the same time, because they are so far out offshore, you need these very long, very heavy subsea power cables need to run underwater and then connect to the grid, which is obviously onshore. And that's actually these cables are actually a very interesting part of the offshore wind developments in Europe because there's essentially a very long queue to get these cables because there aren't so many producers, and it's not that easy to just put up a factory. And the factories also need to be located close to the coast, because as I've said, again, I recommend looking up what these cables look like online. They really, I'm sure you can imagine, it's similar to the internet cables. They're gigantic, very long, very, very heavy. So it's not like you can transport them across the country. So there's a lot of these sort of logistical issues, and the prices of these cables have also gone up in the past years. Because the demand is so high for offshore wind, of course, not only in Poland, but elsewhere in Europe. So this is an interesting aspect. That's how they compare the two technologies.
That's actually fascinating. I don't think I have ever read about this particular issue, so I must definitely update myself. But if you can tell us briefly how Poland does manage with this issue. Has Poland built those factories, or are we importing those cables?
There is one Polish enterprise that produces these cables. That's true, but when it comes to the number of factories and their exact locations, I have to say I don't have all the details. There's a couple producers in Europe, so there's definitely demand to expand the production capacity.
And looking at the larger context, can you tell us a little bit how does Poland's development of the offshore compares to European partners? Offshore has existed in Europe for over 30 years. So who are the leaders of this market?
Denmark, of course. Denmark was the first mover. That's where the first offshore wind farm was developed in 1991 in Vindeby in Denmark. It was very small, it was a demonstration project. It was nothing compared to the size of today's wind farms. And then Denmark was the first mover because it was also the first mover in onshore wind development. That's actually the interesting part about how offshore began in Denmark, is that it was organized in a similar way to how onshore wind farms were developed, and it was very communal. So it was some of the first small projects for offshore were co-owned by these so-called cooperatives. But then it soon turned out that offshore is a much bigger undertaking than onshore wind farms. It's a much more complicated process in terms of permitting and construction. So it was taken over by the private sector. But Denmark, obviously, and then Germany was also one of the pioneers, and then the Netherlands and the UK soon followed. So essentially, countries by the North Sea.
Although Poland is a late adopter of the offshore wind, it seems to be moving very quickly. Can you tell us how Poland's development path differ from those other countries?
Poland is entering at a point where the market is mature, the technology has been around for, as you've said, over 30 years. So the scale is very different, as I've mentioned. The average size, the average power rating of an offshore wind turbine has gone up by a lot. It is now at around 10 megawatts. That's the average power rating of an operating offshore wind turbine. And actually, the first offshore wind farm in Poland will have a 15 megawatt wind turbine. So that's even bigger. So very different scale. And because this technology has already been around for decades, there are some market leaders like the Danish Ørsted or Sweden's Vattenfall, Germany's RWE. So there are some market leaders who have the most know-how, who make up for a large share of the market. So in the case of Poland, those are the companies that the Polish enterprises have partnered with to develop the offshore wind farms. So what we see in Poland's case is that in the first phase, the so-called first phase of offshore wind development, there are 7 projects, and 6 out of those projects are being developed in partnership with these foreign sort of offshore specialists.
What can you explain why the saturation of foreign experts is so heavy in Polish projects?
I think you could say there are a couple different factors. So the first one, as I've said, there are companies who have the expertise on how to carry out these projects. And as I've said, and this is very important in the case of offshore, these are very, very long processes. There's a lot of the time, it's years of effort before you construct anything. Actually, I would say most of the time. So it would be very difficult to carry these projects without this knowledge. That's the first thing, and the second thing is the capital required for these projects. These are very expensive investments due to their size, due to the technology, again, due to how much goes into planning and researching and obtaining the right permits. So it's also about sharing that responsibility, sharing the risks as well. It also makes it easier to obtain capital from commercial banks if you're partnered up with a reliable offshore developer. So it's I would say it comes down mainly to these 2 factors: the expertise and the sort of the ways in which you raise the capital and share the financial risks.
So a skeptical reader, a skeptical listener might then ask, if so much expertise and capital is coming from abroad, how much does Polish economy really gain from these investments?
Oh, it certainly gains multiple gigawatts of clean electricity, energy capacity in the system. Obviously, that's fundamental. But second of all, this is the only feasible way to enter this market and to potentially develop a market here in Poland. And we do see in Poland's national energy and climate plan that the plans for offshore development remain ambitious. The numbers have undergone a correction. So initially it was supposed to be around 18 gigawatts in 2040. Now it's at about 12. But that is still a lot. So there is more. There are many more projects to come potentially, and I think there is potential for Polish enterprises who were early entrants in the market. So especially those who are part of the first phase, there's potential for them to grow their own know-how. At this moment in time, it's just my speculation, but I think they could take larger ownership of the project and potentially be developing these projects by themselves in the future.
When I look at the development of the energy projects on the coast of the Baltic Sea, so when I'm mentioning that, I am referring to both the offshore and the nuclear power plant, which is also being developed. Well, not developed yet, but...
Well, yeah, not constructed yet, but it's under development for sure.
also very near to the place where the offshore wind will be located. There is a lot of talk in the public debate about the local content. So the share of the Polish companies that take part in these projects. But as you say, Polish companies don't really have the expertise to carry out these projects on their own. So can you tell us a little bit about how Poland is trying to increase the share of this local content, allowing more Polish companies to participate in the construction and the profits of this new development?
It's not that straightforward, in the sense that in the EU you cannot bluntly state that you expect a certain level of local content in a project, because we are part of the European single market. So other European, other EU investors are always welcome to participate, simply. But of course, there are ways to support the increase of local engagement, and there is a lot of effort around this. I know that the Polish Wind Energy Association has been making a lot of effort around sort of concentrating the potential participants of the value chain together. So we will. It is unlikely that we will be producing the wind turbines ourselves, because, as I've said, that market is very concentrated, and it for now at least it very much belongs to the few market leaders. But there's potential for us to be delivering other components for the offshore wind farms. So there's potential to secure employment in the Polish north, there to establish factories for some of the other offshore wind farm components. There's potential to provide services as well, such as maintenance, repairs, etc. So that is the hope. That this engagement will be increasing, but it's already. I think it's already happening largely.
As I mentioned in the introduction, there is a lot of firsts in the offshore for Poland, and in December, Poland held its first offshore wind auction. Can you tell us a little bit about this auction, what it was, and why it was important?
This was the first of 4 auctions that have been planned under the second phase of offshore wind development in Poland.
Can you explain to our readers what is the first phase and the second phase of the offshore development?
Definitely. So the first phase was conducted without any auction, so it was not competitive in such a direct sense. And projects or support for projects was awarded based on decisions of the Energy Regulatory Office. So it is literally referred to as regulatory decisions, but of course those decisions were made based on documentation provided by the candidates. So essentially the first phase was open, and this also of course goes for the second phase to those companies that had already secured different types of environmental and construction permits. So again, this comes back to what I've said about how long the pre-construction phase is in offshore, and I don't want to get into the details of what kinds of permits you need to obtain. I don't think it's that interesting. I'm also not the expert on that, but essentially, in order to participate in both cases, you had to provide proof that you had already secured the necessary permits that essentially state that it is possible and safe for you to establish the offshore wind farm in the specific area where you intend to establish it. So under phase 1, there are 7 projects, and some of them are already in construction. As we've mentioned, the first offshore wind farm Baltic Power will hopefully go live this year in 2026. And that is the intention. I'm sure a lot of our listeners out there have a bit of an interest in offshore wind. They may have seen videos of the turbines out in the Baltic Sea already. They're already set up. And there's 6 other projects that are underway. And there will be a total of about 5.9 gigawatts of capacity within these 7 projects. And now the first auction under phase 2 marked the next stage. So it was decided that this time the support would be awarded based on auction bids. So, and I guess it is very important to say what kind of support we're talking about. So we're talking about 2-sided contracts for difference, which essentially means that if the energy price goes below a certain level, then the state will compensate the energy producer, so the offshore wind farm owner, for that difference. And then if the energy price goes above a certain level, then the energy producer gives back the difference. So it's a very expensive support scheme, but it's a very good way of securing clean energy capacity in the system, because although it's expected that, or not expected, but it's very possible that there will come a time within the next 25 years where there is some sort of energy crisis, and the prices go above a certain level, which then means that the state can secure fair prices for energy consumers. So it's a means of protecting consumers, and at the same time, it's a means of incentivizing investment. So this is the kind of support that the state offers, and it's as we've seen with the first auction, it's a very effective way of incentivizing these investments. So under this auction, 3 projects were granted support. They amount to 3.4 gigawatts of capacity, and then there will be another 3 auctions in the next 5 years.
So if I understand correctly what you said, the contracts for difference are good incentives for companies and investors to develop offshore wind, because the state is telling them, listen, whatever happens, if the prices drop, you have the minimum that will allow your investment to produce returns.
Yes.
And
yes.
and if the prices go higher than that, the state can still, as you said, the consumers can profit still from lower prices. In December, when the auction took place, some analysts, however, pointed out that prices set in Poland were higher than in other countries, like, for example, in France or in Ireland. And they also said that support, as you said, which is granted for 25 years, is longer than in many other countries. So should listeners see that as a problem?
There has been, it has been a difficult time for the offshore wind market in the past couple of years. And that is largely due to rising prices. So the fact that, for instance, as I've also mentioned with the subsea cables, the component prices have risen, and the overall cost of the offshore investments has increased, and this has created uncertainties in the market about how much capacity can actually be developed, and about whether it is a good investment. And that's obviously an issue, because we need all the clean energy capacity we can get, essentially, or at least that's the case in Poland. That may not be the case for all countries. Of course, there are some countries in Europe that already predominantly rely on clean energy. What this auction showed is that there's long-term visibility for the market, and it showed that the state was efficient in attracting these investments. And as I've said, contracts for difference are a big cost, but there's long-term returns. As I've mentioned, it's a matter of energy security. It's a matter of protecting consumers from rising energy prices in moments of crisis or turbulence in markets. So what seems like a huge expense right now is actually a really good investment for our energy system. Of course, there's that is to say, it doesn't mean we should be building offshore wind farms without any regard for their cost. You're raising a very important issue, and there's a lot of debate about how much offshore capacity we should be planning for, because it has become more expensive. So, of course, it is a matter of which clean technologies will be most or what mix of clean technologies will be most affordable. And it's a difficult question because you can't predict everything. But we've also, as I've said, we've seen that the plans for offshore wind have been sort of downsized. So now there's an aim for 12 gigawatts instead of 18 gigawatts. And this does have to do with the fact that these projects have become more expensive.
So, and even with this downsizing, just looking at the auction data from last year, which showed, according to the analysts' comments that I have read, Poland accounted for nearly 40% of the offshore capacity auctioned in Europe in 2025. I wonder if that figure shows that Poland is a leader of the offshore development of some kind in Europe, or at least at the Baltic Sea.
In the Baltic Sea, yes, that's what the numbers show in terms of the capacity that Poland will have by 2030. But that's only if we look at the Baltic Sea itself, because so far Denmark and Germany have mainly been constructing their offshore wind farms in the North Sea. That partly has to do with more favorable conditions. So the North Sea has higher wind speeds, for instance, so that matters. And that's also, I think I haven't mentioned this. This is one thing that differentiates offshore and onshore, that we have higher wind speeds in the Baltic Sea compared to the land in Poland. So essentially, you can produce more electricity with the same capacity. So if we look at the EU in general, or Europe even, Poland is definitely one of the leaders in terms of how much is being planned for and how much investment there is happening. But it also sort of, if you look at the capacity that might be added to the system in the next 5 or 10 or 20 years, in Poland, I've mentioned the average power ratings of the wind turbines, and the fact that the offshore wind farms that are being constructed in Poland will have, some of the absolute newest, largest turbines. So it's essentially easier now to add a lot of capacity, because the wind turbines are larger in capacity compared to Denmark and Germany already have. They have, some of the older, smaller ones. And also, it's difficult to compare Poland and Denmark in terms of capacity, because Denmark is a much smaller country. So it has a much lower energy consumption. But I would say, yes, Poland is definitely, as far as the Baltic Sea region goes, it's now emerging as a sort of leader. It's going to be interesting to see how offshore develops in the Baltic states, because there's also some plans, but it's not as advanced as it is in Poland.
Looking ahead at the 2030s and 2040s, what do you think success will look like for Poland's offshore wind sector?
Wow. Wait, that is actually a difficult question. I wanted to say if we add the if we achieve the 12 gigawatts in capacity, but I don't. That's of course that is for now the goal. So I wish for Poland to achieve what it intends in its strategic documents. But I would say that number is not necessarily the most important thing. I hope that we also develop a vast network of offshore wind suppliers and producers, and potentially become a bit of a hub for the Baltic region at least, because that's how that's where we stand to gain the most economically. That's going back to one of your previous questions about what we stand to gain. That's definitely one of those things, especially that now with the decarbonization efforts, a lot of the energy sources are shifting to the north. We historically have had most of our electricity production in the south, in the Silesia region, where the heavy industry was concentrated and where there was most coal resources. So now the weight is shifting a little bit. So I do hope that this becomes a chance to develop some industry in the Pomerania region and the West Pomerania region. And of course, for now, because that's what the NECP declares, I hope for Poland to achieve the exact 11.9 gigawatts by 2040. Of course, that if it changes, then we'll adjust.
And that was Marianna Sobkiewicz from the Polish Economic Institute. Thank you very much for joining us here at the Warsaw Wire.
Thank you so much for having me.
We will include a link to Marianna's report in the show notes for listeners who want to dive deeper into how offshore wind is financed and owned. And if you enjoyed this episode, please comment, like, and subscribe. And thank you. See you next time.